about, the Eucharist being the main form of worship. And as I was listening to it, I just felt like I heard like friends of mine who are still Protestant being like, well, what about in Revelation when John bows down in worship before the angel and the angel's like, no, don't do that. Don't worship me. Worship God. You know, I hear that in the back of my mind as like, okay, well, what about, isn't bowing worship? And don't you do that to saints? Like that's a big verse used to kind of be like a gotcha. Like, oh, you say it's the Eucharist, but look at this Bible verse. Doesn't it mean this?
Yeah, yeah, it's a good question. And so one thing I think is there's an element of truth here in that we often don't take the role of the body in worship very seriously. And so there's sometimes this idea within certain forms of Protestantism. And I don't actually think Pentecostalism is particularly guilty of this because it often tends to be very bodily. But there's some forms of really disembodied kind of Protestant approaches to worship. And that is actually a misunderstanding of what it is to worship God in spirit and truth. Spirit there does not mean non-bodily. Like, we are to be spiritual Christians. That does not mean we need to like have our souls leave our bodies right now. that's not it at all. Revelation 12 talks about how our bodily sacrifices are spiritual worship. I mean, he says that explicitly in Romans 12, verse 1. And so the fact that one of the words for worship in Hebrew literally means to kneel or to go prostrate tells us that there's a reason we kneel at Mass during the Eucharist. There's, like I had a Protestant teacher in grade school who referred to the Mass as Catholic calisthenics because we were like sitting, standing, kneeling, sitting, standing, kneeling. And she was like, what is going on with all of this physical activity? Why are people all as one assuming the same bodily posture? And it's, well, because that is actually the way worship looks, both in the Old Covenant and also in the book of Revelation. That past worship and future worship, and we would say by analogy, present worship, is really corporate and bodily. So that part is true. Like they're right to look at the role of kneeling and the role of like going down and going prostrate before the Lord. But it's not true that therefore all forms of kneeling are sinful or worship or anything like that. And specifically in Revelation 22, John says that he fell down to worship. And there's actually two Greek words being used there. First is pipto, and the second is proskinio. And so he's not just saying he's kneeling to worship. And that's an important detail because it suggests that it's possible to kneel not to worship. And in fact, we see plenty of examples of this. And it's not just me saying that as a Catholic. D.A. Carson, in his commentary on Matthew, points this out. That, for instance, in Matthew 18, 26, the servant falls on his knees, imploring his master, Lord, have patience with me and I'll repay you everything. The servant who owes the unrepayable debt. Now, even though the master in that is sort of in the role of, he's prefiguring God or he's an image of God, we're not meant to understand that the servant is literally worshiping the master. No, the servant is just falling down on his knees asking for forgiveness. Likewise, in Matthew 20, verse 20, the mother of James and John goes up to Jesus and she goes down on her knees. And the same word prosikio is used there not to mean worship. And so the word doesn't automatically mean worship. You know from context. And sometimes it's actually not clear from context. So like, for instance, when the Magi come, this same Greek word is used there, and scholars debate, well, are the Magi worshiping Christ or are they just kneeling down at the manger next to him? So kneeling can be worship. It is not necessarily. The writings of Josephus, the first century Jewish historian, he talks about how you would kneel before the high priest, but he doesn't mean that you worship the high priest. So it's a mistake to assume if someone's kneeling, therefore it's automatically worship. But nevertheless, it's good that people realize that kneeling is a posture of humility and a posture of reverence. And sometimes we're in that posture of humility and reverence because we're worshiping God. So there's a relationship between kneeling and worship, but it's not just a simple, if you're kneeling, you're worshiping. If you're not kneeling, you're not worshiping. Neither of that's an oversimplification of the relationship of the body to worship.
So with that in mind, I think maybe how I would have thought of that as a Protestant would be like, okay, well, how do you tell the difference? Like, if I kneel before the crucifix and praying to God and, saying, God, you're like, blessed be your name. I love you. Thank you for everything you do for me. A Catholic could go and kneel before Mary and be like, you know, blessed are you, our mother of God. Thank you for everything you do for me. Like, what is the difference there? Like, because
Yeah.
I think a lot of Protestants feel like they're being gaslit by Catholics who are
Yeah,
like,
no,
oh,
it's
we
totally
only,
fair.
you know,
And because well, there's two ways of exploring the question. One is how can I tell what my neighbor's doing? And the short answer is you can't mind your own business. Like this. Oh, you're going to look at their bodily posture and make sweeping conclusions about their theology? Wrong. Like that's just not a biblical way of understanding my relationship to my neighbor. And so, yeah, I'm glad you can't do that. I'm glad you can't just judge their heart because you've actually been warned against that. But the other thing is like, well, how do I know if I'm falling into worship? And here I would say the heart of worship is sacrifice. And so St. Augustine actually talks about this, that all the other things we offer to God, we offer to other people as well. So let's think about it. So with teaching and preaching, we talk about God. Well, do we talk about other people? Sure we do. Often in very good ways. Not just in like negative, like gossipy ways. I mean, like you could teach a class on Plato or Aristotle. Prayer is talking to God. Do we talk to other people? I mean, literally, we're doing that right now. And then part of worship is honoring God. Do we honor other people? We do. But the thing that is essential to divine worship, the thing that only happens in divine worship, is we don't make sacrifices to other people. Now, we may make sacrifices for other people. You allow someone to inconvenience you and all of that. We don't like burn offerings to other people. We don't offer the Eucharist to other people. And so there was actually a small heretical sect in early Christianity that tried to offer the Eucharist to Mary. And the Catholic Church condemned that as idolatry because it was. Because it was taking this thing that is at the heart of divine worship and trying to give it to someone who isn't God. But everything else we do to one another, not just, to Mary and the saints, but literally to other people. And that includes even things like you might go down on your knees to beg for forgiveness. You might go down on your knees to propose marriage, to be knighted, all of this, including the bodily stuff. Now, largely in the modern West, we've lost these kind of physical expressions of humility and prostration. But that's our loss. That's not a biblical problem. If you go back to the ancient world, the world in which the Jews and Gentiles and Christians are living, you would have all of those things without it being worship. And so that's where, the way to tell if you're worshiping is, one, do I regard the person whom I'm approaching as God? And two, am I offering them sacrifice? And because you can't really judge that of an outsider typically, it means you don't really get room to judge your neighbor.
Thanks. I think that that's a really important distinction. And I think it makes it difficult, for a lot of people who are looking at the Catholic Church from the outside, because they do jump to that conclusion, right? Like they see
Yeah. Well,
people
sorry,
bowing.
I know you're. Sorry. I just thought of something that I think is really relevant to this, that if you don't mind me just kind of hijacking right now, that a lot of conversations I've had with Protestants, they will have a definition of worship that is something like loving a thing more than it should be loved. And that is not a biblical definition of worship at all. That might be what we would call a disordered attachment, that you're not in right relationship with the thing. And it might be a sign that you worship it. Like if you worship mammon, then you spend more time thinking about it than you should. But the twofold question is, do I regard it as God? And do I make sacrifices to it? And so how can we talk about something like covetousness, like idolatry, mammon, all of this stuff as idolatry and as false worship? Jesus actually gives us an example of this, because in whom are we placing our trust? And so he warns us not to have anxiety. You remember the famous part where he talks in Matthew's gospel about the grass of the lilies of the field and then sparrows, and how God takes care of them. And he says not to have anxiety because we can only serve one master. We can't serve two. And these are like two parts that are often just like decoupled, and we don't realize Jesus is making one argument. that if you look at where your anxieties are, then you can see where your idolatries are. In other words, the biggest risk is not, I'm going to think that Mary saves me apart from God. The biggest risk is that I'm going to think God isn't enough for me to be okay and happy in life, and I need something else. I need professional success. I need the love of others. I need money. I need fill in the blank. And I've put something else where it's God plus something else. But that God plus is not really his saints. Like that's not the thing leading us away from him. That's the thing leading us towards him. Because as you're spending more time realizing your own weakness and unworthiness, as you're, in other words, like the people who you see really devoted to Mary and the saints are the people who are also really devoted to God. That's not a coincidence. If the Protestant kind of vision was right, you'd see those people being indifferent to God, and you really don't see that. There's plenty of examples of saints who demonstrate what this looks like. So I give all of that to say, if, a lot of Protestants are extremely anxious about accidental idolatry by imagining that they'll fall into idolatry if they love anything more than it should be loved. And by that standard, you can't just be like, world's best dad for Father's Day. You have to be like, you're okay, Dad. But if I love you more, then maybe I worship you. And it's like, that's insane. That is not the biblical approach to worship.